Chapter 32 of Havoc by Phillips OPPENHEIM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss, Audiobooks.com. Chapter 32. Morrison is Desperate. Certainly it was a strange little gathering that waited in Morrison's room for the coming of Laverick. There was Lassen, flushed, ugly, breathing heavily, and watching the door with fixed, beady eyes. There was Adolf Kahn, the man who had strolled out from the Milan hotel as Laverick had entered it, leaving the forged order behind him. There was Streuss, stern and desperate with anxiety. There was Morrison himself, in the clothes of a workman, worn to a shadow, with the furtive gleam of terrified guilt shining in his sunken eyes, and the slouched shoulders and broken mien of the habitual criminal. There was Zoe, around whom they were all standing, with anger burning in her cheeks and gleaming out of her passion-filled eyes. She, too, like the others, watched the door. So they waited. Streuss, not for the first time, moved to the window, and drawing aside the curtains, looked down into the street. "Will he come, this Englishman?" he muttered. "Has he courage?" "More courage than you who keep a girl here against her will," Zoe panted, looking at him defiantly. "More courage than my poor brother, who stands there like a coward." "Shut up, Zoe!" Morrison exclaimed harshly. "There is nothing for you to be furious about or frightened. No one wants to ill-treat you. These gentlemen all want to behave kindly to us. It is Laverick they want." "And you," she cried, "are content to stand by and let him walk into a trap. You let them even use my name to bring him here. Arthur, be a man. Have nothing more to do with them. Help me to get away from this place. Call out. Do something instead of standing there and wasting the precious minutes." He came towards her, ugly and threatening. "I'll do something in a minute," he declared savagely. "Something you won't like, either. Keep your mouth shut, I tell you. It's me or him, and by heavens, he deserves what he'll get." Streuss turned away from the window and looked towards Zoe. "Young lady," he said quietly, "let me beg you not to distress yourself so. I sincerely trust that nothing unpleasant will happen. If it does, I promise you that we will arrange for your temporary absence. You shall not be disturbed in any way." "And as regards your brother, have a care, young lady," Lassen growled. "If anyone's in danger, it's he. He'll be lucky if he saves his own skin." The young man glowered at her. "You hear that, you little fool?" he muttered. "Keep still, can't you?" Her face was full of defiance. He came nearer to her and changed his tone. "Zoe," he whispered hoarsely, "don't you understand? If they can't get what they want from Laverick, they'll visit it upon me. They're desperate, I tell you. They mean mischief all the time. Yet you let them be brought here, your partner who looked after you when you were ill, and who helped you to get away," she cried indignantly. He laughed unpleasantly. "When it comes to a matter of life or death, it's every man for himself. Besides, if I'd known as much about Laverick as I know now, I'm not sure that I should have been so ready to go, not empty-handed by any manner of means." "What have you done that you should be so much in the power of these people?" she demanded, fixing her dark eyes upon him searchingly. The terror whitened his face once more. The perspiration stood out in beads upon his forehead. "Don't dare to ask me questions!" he exclaimed nervously. "I should like to know what Laverick is to you, that you take so much interest in him? Listen here, my fine young lady. If I've been mug enough to do the dirty work, he hasn't made any bones about taking advantage of it. He's a nice sort of sportsman, I can tell you." The man at the window suddenly dropped the curtain and spoke across the room to them all. "He is here," he announced. "Alone?" Lassen asked thickly. "Alone," Streuss echoed. A little thrill seemed to pass through the room. Zoe made no attempt to cry out. Instead, she leaned forward towards the door, as though listening. Her attitude seemed harmless enough. No one took any more notice of her. They all watched the entrance to the apartment. Zoe remembered the 2 flights of stairs. She was absorbed in a breathless calculation. Now he should be coming quite close. Her whole being was concentrated upon one effort of listening. At last she raised her head. The room resounded with her cries. "Don't come in! Don't come in here!" she shrieked. "Mr. Laverick, do you hear? Go away! Don't come in here alone!" Her brother was the first to reach her. His hand fell upon her mouth brutally. Her little effort was naturally a failure, defeating, in fact, in its own object. Laverick, hearing her cries, simply hastened his coming, threw open the door without waiting to knock, and stepped quickly across the threshold. He saw a man dressed in shabby workman's clothes, unshaven, disheveled, holding Zoe in a rough grasp, and with a single well-directed blow he sent him reeling across the room. Then something in the man's cry, a momentary glimpse of his white face, revealed his identity. "Morrison!" he cried. "Good God, it's Morrison!" Arthur Morrison was crouching in a corner of the room, his evil face turned upon his aggressor. Laverick took quick stock of his surroundings. There was a tall, fair young man, Adolf Kahn, whom he had seen at the Milan a few hours ago, the man who had unsuccessfully forged his name. There was Lassen, the man who, under pretense of being her manager, had been a spy upon Louise. There was Streuss, with blanched face and hard features, standing with his back to the door. There was Zoe, and behind, her brother. She held out her hands timidly towards him, and her eyes were soft with pleading. "I did not want you to come here, Mr. Laverick," she cried softly. "I tried so hard to stop you. It was not I who sent that message." He took her cold little fingers and raised them to her lips. "I know it, dear," he murmured. Then a movement in the room warned him, and he was suddenly on guard. Lassen was close to his side, some evil purpose plainly enough written in his pasty face and unwholesome eyes. Laverick gave him his left shoulder and sent him staggering across the floor. He was angry at having been outwitted, and his eyes gleamed ominously. "Well, gentlemen," he exclaimed, "you seem to have taken unusual pains to secure my presence here. Tell me now, what can I do for you?" It was Streuss who became spokesman. He addressed Laverick with the consideration of one gentleman addressing another. His voice had many agreeable qualities. His demeanor was entirely amicable. "Mr. Laverick," he answered, "let us first apologize if we used a little subterfuge to procure for us the pleasure of your visit. We are men who are in earnest, and across whose path you have either wilfully or accidentally strayed. An understanding between us has become a necessity." "Go on," Laverick interrupted. "Tell me exactly who you are and what you want." "As to who we are," Streuss answered, "does that really matter? I repeat that we are men who are in earnest. Let that be enough. As to what we want, it is a certain document to which we have every claim and which has come into your possession. I flatter you somewhat, Mr. Laverick, if I say by chance." Laverick shrugged his shoulders. "Let that go," he said. "I know all about the document you refer to, and the notes. They were contained in a pocketbook, which, it is perfectly true, has come into my possession. Prove your claim to both, and you shall have them." Streuss smiled. "You will admit that our claim, since we know of its existence," he asked suavely, "is equal to yours?" "Certainly," Laverick answered. "But then I never had any idea of keeping either the document or the money. That your claim is better than mine is no guarantee that there is not some one else whose title is better still." Streuss frowned. "Be reasonable, Mr. Laverick," he begged. "We are men of peace when peace is possible. The money of which you spoke you can consider as treasure trove, if you will. But it is our intention to possess ourselves of the document. It is for that reason that we are here in London. I personally am committed to the extent of my life and honor to its recovery." A declaration of war, courteously veiled but decisive. Laverick looked around him a little defiantly and shrugged his shoulders. "You know very well that I do not carry it about with me," he said. "The gentleman on my left," he added, pointing to Kahn, "can tell you where it is kept." "Quite so," Streuss admitted. "We are not doing you the injustice to suppose that you would be so foolhardy as to trust yourself anywhere with that document upon your person. It is in the safe at the Milan Hotel. I may add that probably, if it had not occurred to you to change your quarters, it would have been in our possession before now. We are hoping to persuade you to return to the hotel with one of our friends here and procure it." "As it happens," Laverick remarked, "that is impossible. The man who set the combination for that particular safe has gone off duty and will not be back again at the hotel till tomorrow morning." "But he is to be found," Streuss answered easily. "His present whereabouts and his address are known to us. He lives with his family at Harvard Court, Hampstead. We shall assist you in making it worth his while to return to the hotel or to give you the combination word for the safe." "You are rather great on detail," Laverick exclaimed. "It is our business. The question for you to decide, and to decide immediately, is whether you are ready to end this, in some respects, constrained situation, and give your word to place that document in our hands." "You are ready to accept my word, then?" Laverick answered. "We have a certain hold upon you," Streuss continued slowly. "Your partner, Mr. Morrison's position in connection with the murder in Crooked Friars Alley is, as you may have surmised, a somewhat unfortunate one. Your own I will not allude to. I will simply suggest that for both your sakes publicity, any measure of publicity, in fact, as regards this little affair, would not be desirable." Laverick hesitated. He understood all that was implied. Morrison's eyes were fixed upon him, the eyes of a craven coward. He felt the intensity of the moment. Then Zoe turned suddenly towards him. "You are not to give it up!" she cried with trembling lips. "They cannot hurt you, and it is not true about Arthur." Kahn, who was nearest, clapped his hand over her mouth, and Laverick knocked him down. Instantly the pacific atmosphere of the room was changed. Lassen and Morrison closed swiftly upon Laverick from different sides. Streuss covered him with the shining barrel of a revolver. "Mr. Laverick," he said, "we are not here to be trifled with. Keep your sister quiet, Morrison, or by God you'll swing." Laverick looked at the revolver, fascinated for an instant by its unexpected appearance. The face of the man who held it had changed. There was lightning playing about the room. "It's the dock for you both!" Streuss exclaimed fiercely. "For you, Laverick, and for you, Morrison, too, if you play with us any longer. One of you's a murderer, and the other receives the booty. Who are you to have scruples? Criminals, both of you! Your place is in the dock, and you shall be there within 24 hours if there are any more evasions. Now, Laverick, will you fetch that document? It is your last chance." Upon the breathless silence that followed, a quiet voice intervened, a voice calm and emotionless, tinged with a measure of polite inquiry. Yet its level utterance fell like a bomb among the little company. The curtain separating this from the inner room had been drawn a few feet back, and Bellamy was standing there in black overcoat and white muffler, his silk hat on the back of his head, his left hand, carefully gloved, resting still upon the curtain which he had drawn aside. "I hope I am not disturbing you at all," he murmured softly. For a moment the development of the situation remained uncertain. The gleaming barrel of Streuss's revolver changed its destination. Bellamy glanced at it with the pleased curiosity of a child. "I really ought not to have intruded," he continued amiably. "I happened to hear the address my friend Laverick gave to the taxicab driver, and I was particularly anxious to have a word or two with him before I left for the Continent." Streuss was surely something of a charlatan. His revolver had disappeared. The smile upon his lips was both gracious and unembarrassed. "One is always only too pleased to welcome Mr. Bellamy anywhere, anyhow," he declared. "If apologies are needed at all," he continued, "it is to our friend and host, Mr. Morrison here. Permit me, Mr. Arthur Morrison, the Honorable David Bellamy. These are Mr. Morrison's rooms." Morrison could do no more than stare. Bellamy, on the contrary, with a little bow came further into the apartment, removing his hat from his head. Lassen glided round behind him, remaining between Bellamy and the heavy curtains. Adolf Kahn moved as though unconsciously in front of the door of the room in which they were in. Bellamy smiled courteously. "I am afraid," he said, "that I must not stay for more than a moment. I have a car full of friends below. We are on our way, in fact, to the Covent Garden Ball. And one or two of them, I fear," he added indulgently, "have already reached that stage of exhilaration which such an entertainment in England seems to demand. They will certainly come and rout me out if I am here much longer. There!" he exclaimed. "You hear that?" There was the sound of a motor horn from the street below. Streuss, with an oath trembling upon his lips, lifted the blind. There were two motor cars waiting there, large cars with limousine bodies and apparently full of men. After all, it was to be expected. Bellamy was no fool. "Since we are to lose you, then, Mr. Laverick," Streuss remarked with a gesture of farewell, "let us say good night. The little matter of business which we were discussing can be concluded with your partner." Laverick turned towards Zoe. Their eyes met, and he read their message of terror. "You are coming back to your own rooms, Miss Leneveu," he said. "You must let me offer you my escort." She half rose, but in obedience to a gesture from Streuss, Morrison moved near to them. "If you leave me here, Laverick," he muttered beneath his breath, "if you leave me to these hounds, do you know what they will do? They will hand me over to the police. They have sworn it." "Why did you come back?" Laverick asked quickly. "They stopped me as I was boarding the steamer," Morrison declared. "I tell you that they have eyes everywhere. You cannot move without their knowledge. I had to come. Now that I am here, they have told me plainly the price of my freedom. It is that document. Laverick, it is my life. You must give in. You must indeed. Remember, you're in it too." "Am I?" Laverick asked quietly. "You fool! Of course you are!" Morrison whispered hoarsely. "Didn't you come into that entry and take the pocketbook? Heaven knows what possessed you to do it. Heaven knows how you found the pluck to use the money. But you did it, and you are a criminal as I am. Don't be a fool, Laverick. Make terms with these people. They want the document, nothing but the document. They will let us keep the money." "And you?" Laverick asked, turning suddenly to Zoe. "What do you say about all this?" She looked at him fearlessly. "I trust you," she said. "I trust you to do what is right." Chapter 32. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 33 of Havoc by E. Phillips OPPENHEIM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 33. Laverick's Arrest. At last, David. Louise welcomed her visitor eagerly with outstretched hands, which Bellamy raised for a moment to his lips. Then she turned toward the third person, who had also risen at the opening of the door. A short, somewhat thick-set man with swarthy complexion, close-cropped black hair, and upturned black moustache. "You remember Prince Rosmaran?" she said to Bellamy. "He left Servia only the day before yesterday. He has come to England on a special mission to the King." Bellamy shook hands. "I think," he remarked, "I had the honor of meeting you once before, Prince, at the opening of the Servian Parliament 2 years ago. It was just then, I believe, that you were elected to lead the patriotic party." The Prince bowed sadly. "My leadership, I fear," he declared, "has brought little good to my unhappy country." "It is a terrible crisis through which your nation is passing," Bellamy reminded him sympathetically. "At the same time, we must not despair. Austria holds out her clenched hands, but as yet she has not dared to strike." The face of the Prince was dark with passion. "As yet, no," he answered. "But how long, I wonder, before the blow falls? We in Servia have been blamed for arming ourselves, but I tell you that today the Austrian troops are being secretly concentrated on the frontier. Their arsenals are working night and day. Her soldiers are maneuvering almost within sight of Belgrade. We have hoped against hope, yet in our hopes we know that our fate was sealed when the Czar of Russia left Vienna last week." "Nothing is certain," Bellamy declared restlessly. "England has been ill-governed for a great many years, but we are not yet a negligible power." Louise leaned a little towards him. "David," she whispered, "the compact." He answered her unspoken question. "It is arranged," he said, "finished. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock I receive it." "You are sure?" she begged. "Why need there be any delay?" "It is locked up in a powerful safe," he explained, "and the clerk who has the combination will not be on duty again till 9. Laverick is there simply waiting for the hour. You were right, Louise, as usual. I should have trusted him from the first." The Prince had been listening to their conversation with undisguised interest. "There is a rumor," he said, "that some secret information concerning the compact of Vienna has found its way to this country." Bellamy smiled. "Hence, I presume, your mission, Prince. We three have no secrets from one another," the Prince declared. "Our interests in this matter are absolutely identical. What you suggest, Mr. Bellamy, is the truth. There is a rumor that the Chancellor, in the first few moments of his illness, gave valuable information to some one who is likely to have communicated it to the Government here." To be forewarned is to be forearmed. That, I know, is one of your own mottos. So I am here to know if there is anything to be learned." Bellamy nodded. "Your arrival is not inopportune, Prince. When did you come?" "I reached Charing Cross at midnight," the Prince answered. "Our train was an hour late. I am presenting my credentials early this morning, and I am hoping for an interview during the afternoon." Bellamy considered for a moment. "It is true," he said. "Between us three there is indeed no need for secrecy. The information you speak of will be in our hands within a few hours. I have no doubt whatever but that your Minister will share in it." "You know of what it consists?" the Prince inquired curiously. "I think so," Bellamy answered, glancing at the clock. "For my own part, although the information itself is invaluable, I see another and a profounder source of interest in that document. If indeed it is what we believe it to be, it amounts to a casus belli." "You mean that you would provoke war?" Prince Flammarion asked. Bellamy shrugged his shoulders. Said he, "I am not even a politician. But you know the lookers-on see a good deal of the game, and in my opinion there is only one course open for this country—to work upon Russia so that she withdraws from any compact she may have entered into with Austria and Germany, to accept Germany's cooperation with Austria in the despoilment of your country as a casus belli, and to declare war at once while our fleet is invincible and our colonies free from danger." The Prince nodded. "It is good," he admitted, "to hear a man's talk once more. Wherever one moves, people bow the head before the might of Germany and Austria. Let them alone but a little longer, and they will indeed rule Europe." 3 o'clock struck. The Prince rose. "I go," he announced. "And I," Bellamy declared. "Come to my rooms at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, Prince, and you shall hear the news." Bellamy lingered behind. For a moment he held Louise in his arms and gazed sorrowfully into her weary face. "Is it worth while, I wonder?" he asked bitterly. "Worth while," she answered, opening her eyes and looking at him, "to feel the mother love? Who can help it who would not be ignoble?" "But yours, dear," he murmured, "is all grief. Even now I am afraid." "We can do no more than toil to the end," she said. "David, you are sure this time?" "I am sure," he replied. "I am going back now to the hotel where Laverick is staying. We are going to sit together and smoke until the morning. Nothing short of an army could storm the hotel. I was with them all only an hour ago. Streuss, that blackguard Lassen, and Adolf Kahn, the police spy. They are beaten men, and they know it. They had Laverick, had him by a trick, but I made a dramatic entrance, and the game was up." "Telephone me directly when you have taken it safely to Downing Street," she begged. "I will," he promised. Bellamy walked from Dover Street to the Strand. The streets were almost brilliant with the cold, hard moonlight. The air seemed curiously keen. Once or twice the fall of his feet upon the pavement was so clear and distinct that he fancied he was being followed, and glanced sharply around. He reached the Milan Hotel, however, without adventure, and looked towards the little open space in the hall where he had expected to find Laverick. There was no one there. He stood still for a moment, troubled with a sudden sense of apprehension. The place was deserted except for a couple of sleepy-looking clerks and a small army of cleaners busy with their machines down in the restaurant, moving about like mysterious figures in the dim light. Bellamy turned back to the hall porter, who had admitted him. "Do you happen to know what has become of the gentleman whom I was with about an hour ago?" he asked. "A tall, fair gentleman. Mr. Laverick his name was." The hall porter recognized Bellamy and touched his hat. "Why, yes, sir," he answered, with a somewhat mysterious air. "Mr. Laverick was sitting over there in an easy-chair until about half an hour ago. Then 2 gentlemen arrived in a taxicab and inquired for him. They talked for a little time, and finally Mr. Laverick went away with them." Bellamy was puzzled. "Went away with them?" he repeated. "I don't understand that, Reynolds. He was to have waited here till I returned." The man hesitated. "It didn't strike me, sir," he said, "that Mr. Laverick was very wishful to go. It seemed as though he hadn't much choice about the matter." Bellamy looked at him keenly. "Tell me what is in your mind?" he asked.
"Mr. Bellamy, sir," the hall porter replied. "I knew one of those gentlemen by sight. He was a detective from Scotland Yard, and the one who was with him was a policeman in plain clothes." "Good God!" Bellamy exclaimed. "You think, then—" "I am afraid there was no doubt about it, sir," the man answered. "Mr. Laverick was arrested on some charge." Chapter 33. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 34 of Havoc by E. Phillips OPPENHEIM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 34. Morrison's Disclosure. Into New Oxford Street, one of the ceaseless streams of polyglot humanity, came Zoe from her cheerless day bound for the theatre. She was a little whiter, a little more tired than usual. All day long she had heard nothing of Laverick. All day long she had sat in her tiny room with the memory of that horrible night before her. She had tried in vain to sleep. She had made no effort whatever to eat. She knew now why Arthur Morrison had fled away. She knew the cause of that paroxysm of fear in which he had sought her out. The horror of the whole thing had crept into her blood like poison. Life was once more a dreary, profitless struggle. All the wonderful dreams which had made existence seem almost like a fairy tale for this last week had faded away. She was once more a mournful little waif among the pitiless crowds. She turned to the left and passed the Holborn Tube. Boys were shouting everywhere the contents of the evening papers. Nearly everyone seemed to be carrying one of the pink sheets. She herself passed on with unseeing eyes. News was nothing to her. Governments might rise and fall. War might come and go. She had still life to support, a friendless little life, too, on £2 15 a week. The news they shouted fell upon deaf ears, but one boy unfurled almost before her eyes the headlines of his sheet. Sensational arrest of a well-known stockbroker. Charge of murder. She came to a sudden stop and pulled out her purse. Her fingers trembled so that the penny fell onto the pavement. The boy picked it up willingly enough, however, and she passed on with the paper in her hand. There it was on the front page, staring her in the face. Early yesterday morning, Mr. Stephen Laverick, of the firm of Laverick and Morrison, stockbrokers, Old Broad Street, was arrested at the Milan Hotel on the charge of being concerned in the murder of a person unknown in Crooked Friars Alley on Monday last. The accused, who made no reply to the charge, was removed to Bow Street Police Station. Particulars of his examination before the magistrates will be found on page 4. There was a dull singing in her ears. An electric tram, coming up from the underground passage, seemed to bring with it some sort of thunder from an unknown world. She staggered on, unseeing, gasping for breath. If she could find somewhere to sit down! If she could only rest for a moment! Then a sudden wave of strength came to her. The blood flowed once more in her veins, blood that was hot with anger, that stained her cheeks with a spot of red. It was the man she loved, this, being made to suffer falsely. It was the fulfillment of their threat, a deliberate plot against him. The murderer of Crooked Friars Alley, she knew who that was. She knew. Perhaps she might help. She had not the slightest recollection of the remainder of that walk, but she found herself presently sitting in a quiet corner of the theatre with the paper spread out before her. She read that Stephen Laverick had been brought before Mr. Rawson, the magistrate of Bow Street Police Court, on a warrant charging him with having been concerned with the murder of a person unknown, and that he had pleaded not guilty. Her eyes glittered as she read that first witness called was Mr. Arthur Morrison, late partner of the accused. She read his deposition, that he had left Laverick at their offices at 11 o'clock on the night in question, that they were at that time absolutely without means and had no prospect of meeting their engagements on the morrow. She read the evidence of Mr. Fenwick, bank manager, to the effect that Mr. Laverick had, on the following morning, deposited with him the sum of £20,000 in Bank of England notes, by means of which the engagements of the firm were duly met, that those notes had since been redeemed, and that he had no idea of their present whereabouts. She read, too, the evidence of Adolf Kahn, an Austrian visiting this country upon private business, who deposed that he was in the vicinity just before midnight, that he saw a person whom he identified as the accused walking down the street and, after disappearing for a few minutes down the entry, return and re-enter the offices from which he had issued. He explained his presence there by the fact that he was waiting for a clerk employed by the Goodfields Corporation Limited, whose offices were close by. Further formal evidence was given, and a remand asked for. The accused solicitor was on the point of addressing the court when Mr. Rawson was unfortunately taken ill. After waiting for some time, the case was adjourned until the next day, and the accused man was removed in custody. Zoe laid down the paper and rose to her feet. She made her way to where the stage manager was superintending the erection of some new scenery. "Mr. Heepman," she exclaimed, "I cannot stay to rehearsal. I have to go out." He turned heavily round and looked at her. "Rehearsal postponed," he declared solemnly. "Shall you be back for the evening performance, or shall we close the theatre?" His clumsy irony missed its mark. Her thoughts were too intensely focused upon one thing. "I am sorry," she replied, turning away. "I will come back as soon as I can." He called out after her, and she paused. "Look here," he said. "You were absent from the performance the other evening, and now you are skipping rehearsal without even waiting for permission. It can't be done, young lady. You must do your playing around some other time. If you're not here when you're called, you needn't trouble to turn up again. Do you understand?" Her lips quivered, and the sense of impending disaster which seemed to be brooding over her life became almost overwhelming. "I'll come back as soon as I can," she promised, with a little break in her voice. "As soon as ever I can, Mr. Heepman." She hurried out of the theatre, and took her place once more among the hurrying throng of pedestrians. Several people turned round to look at her. Her white face, tight-drawn mouth, and eyes almost unnaturally large, seemed to have become the abiding place for tragedy. She herself saw no one. She would have taken a cab, but a glimpse at the contents of her purse dissuaded her. She walked steadily on to Jermyn Street, walked up the stairs to the third floor, and knocked at her brother's door. No one answered her at first. She turned the handle and entered to find the room empty. There were sounds, however, in the further apartment, and she called out to him. "Arthur!" she cried. "Are you there?" "Who is it?" he demanded. "It is I, Zoe!" she exclaimed. "What do you want?" "I want to speak to you, Arthur. I must speak to you. Please come as quickly as you can." He growled something, and in a few moments he appeared. He was wearing the morning clothes in which he had attended court earlier in the day, but the change in him was perhaps all the more marked by reason of this resumption of his old attire. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes scarcely for an instant seemed to lose that feverish gleam of terror with which he had returned from Liverpool. He knew very well what she had come about, and he began nervously to try and bully her. "I wish you wouldn't come to these rooms, Zoe," he said. "I've told you before they're bachelors' apartments, and they don't like women about the place. What is it? What do you want?" "I was brought here last time without any particular desire on my part," she answered, looking him in the face. "I've come now to ask you what accursed plot this is against Stephen Laverick. What were you doing in the court this morning, lying? What is the meaning of it, Arthur?" "If you come to talk rubbish like that," he declared roughly, "you'd better be off." "No, it is not rubbish," she went on fearlessly. "I think I can understand what it is that has happened. They have terrified you and bribed you until you are willing to do any despicable thing, even this. Your father was good to my mother, Arthur, and I have tried to feel towards you as though you were indeed a relation. But nothing of that counts. I want you to realize that I know the truth, and that I will not see an innocent man convicted while the guilty go free." He moved a step towards her. They were on opposite sides of the small round table which stood in the centre of the apartment. "What do you mean?" he demanded hoarsely. "Isn't it plain enough?" she exclaimed. "You came to my rooms a week or so ago, a terrified, broken down man. If ever there was guilt in a man's face, it was in yours. You sent for Laverick. He pitied you and helped you away. At Liverpool they would not let you embark, these men. They have brought you back here. You are their tool. But you know very well, Arthur, that it was not Stephen Laverick who killed the man in Crooked Friars Alley. You know very well that it was not Stephen Laverick." "Why the devil should I know anything about it?" he asked fiercely. A note of passion suddenly crept into her voice. Her little white hand with its accusing forefinger shot out towards him. "Because it was you, Arthur Morrison, who committed that crime," she cried. "And sooner than another man should suffer for it, I shall go to court myself and tell the truth." He was, for the moment, absolutely speechless, pale as death, with nervously twitching lips and fingers. But there was murder in his eyes. "What do you know about this?" he muttered. "Never mind," she answered. "I know, and I guess quite enough to convince me, and I think anybody else, that you are the guilty man. I would have helped you and shielded you, whatever it cost me, but I will not do so at Stephen Laverick's expense." "What is Laverick to you?" he growled. "He is nothing to me," she replied, "but the best of friends. Even were he less than that, do you suppose that I would let an innocent man suffer?" He moistened his dry lips rapidly. "You are talking nonsense, Zoe," he said. "Nonsense. Even if there has been some little mistake, what could I do now? I have given my evidence. So far as I am concerned, the case is finished. I shall not be called again until the trial." "Then you had better go to the magistrates tomorrow morning and take back your evidence," she declared boldly. "For if you do not, I shall be there, and I shall tell the truth." "Zoe," he gasped, "don't try me too high. This thing has upset me. I'm ill. Can't you see it, Zoe? Look at me. I haven't slept for weeks. Night and day I've had the fear always with me. You don't know what it is. You can't imagine. It's like a terrible ghost keeping pace with you wherever you go, laying his icy finger upon you whenever you would rest, mocking at you when you try to drown thought even for a moment. Don't you try me too far, Zoe. I'm not responsible. Laverick isn't the man you think him to be. He isn't the man I believed. He did have that money. He did, indeed." "That," she said, "is to be explained. But he is not a murderer." "Listen to me, Zoe," Morrison continued, leaning across the table. "Come and stay with me for a time, and we will go away for a week, somewhere to the seaside. We will talk about this and think it over. I want to get away from London. We will go to Brighton, if you like. I must do something for you, Zoe. I'm afraid I've neglected you a good deal. Perhaps I could get you a better part at one of the theatres. I must make you an allowance. You ought to be wearing better clothes." She drew a little away. "I want nothing from you, Arthur," she said, "except this, that you speak the truth." He wiped his forehead and struck the table before her. "But good God, Zoe!" he exclaimed. "Do you know what it is that you are asking me? Do you want me to go into court and say, 'That isn't a man. It is I who am the murderer'? Do you want me to feel their hands upon my shoulder, to be put there in the dock and have all the people staring at me curiously because they know that before very long I am to stand upon the scaffold and have that rope around my neck and—" He broke off with a low cry, wringing his hands like a child in a fit of impotent terror. But the girl in front of him never flinched. "Arthur," she said, "crime is a terrible thing, but nothing in the world can alter its punishment. If it is frightful for you to think of this, what must it be for him? And you are guilty, and he is not." "I was mad," Morrison went on, now almost beside himself. "Zoe, I was mad. I called there to have a drink. We were broke. The firm was broke. I'd 100 or so in my pocket, and I was going to bolt the next day. And there, within a few yards of me, was that man, with such a roll of notes as I had never seen in my life. £500, every one of them, and a wad as thick as my fist. Zoe, they fascinated me. I had 2 drinks quickly, and I followed him out. Somehow or other I'd found that I'd caught up a knife that was on the counter. I never meant to hurt him seriously, but I wanted some of those notes. I was leaving the next day for America, and I hadn't enough money to make a fair start. I wanted it. My God, how I wanted money!" "It couldn't have been worth that," she cried, looking at him wonderingly. "I was mad," he continued. "I saw the notes, and they went to my head. Men do wild things sometimes when they are drunk or for love. I don't drink much, and I'm not over fond of women. But, my God, money is like the blood of my body to me. I saw it, and I wanted it, and I wanted it, and I went mad. "Zoe, you won't give me away. Say you won't." "But what am I to do?" she protested. "He must not suffer." "He'll get off," Morrison assured her thickly. "I tell you, he'll get off. He's only to part with a document which never belonged to him, and the charge will be withdrawn. They know who the murdered man was. They know where the money came from which he was carrying. I tell you, he can save himself. You wouldn't dream of sending me to the gallows, Zoe." "Stephen Laverick will never give up that document to those people," she declared. "I am sure of that." "It's his own lookout," Morrison muttered. "He has the chance, anyway." She turned toward the door. "I must go away," she said. "I must go away and think. It is all too horrible." He came round the table swiftly and caught at her wrist. "Listen," he said. "I can't let you go like this. You must tell me that you are not going to give me up. Do you hear?" "I can make no promises, Arthur," she answered sadly. "Only this. I shall not let Stephen Laverick suffer in your stead." He opened his hand, and she shrank back terrified when she saw what it was that he was holding. Then he struck her down, and without a backward glance, fled out of the place. Chapter 34. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 35 of Havoc by E. Phillips OPPENHEIM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 35. Bellamy's Success. Late that afternoon, the hall porter at the Milan Hotel, the commissionaire, and the chief maître d'hôtel from the café, who happened to be in the hall, together with several others around the place, who knew Stephen Laverick by sight, were treated to an unexpected surprise. A large closed motor car drove up to the front entrance, and several men descended, among whom was Laverick himself. He nodded to the hall porter, whose salute was purely mechanical, and making his way without hesitation to the interior of the hotel, presented his receipt at the cashier's desk and asked for his packet. The clerk looked up at him in amazement. He did not for the moment notice that the two men standing immediately behind him bore the stamp of plain-clothes policemen. He had only a few minutes ago finished reading the report of Laverick's examination before the magistrates, and his remand until the morrow upon the charge of murder. His knowledge of English law was by no means perfect, but he was at least aware that Laverick's appearance outside the purlieus of the prison was an unusual happening. "Your packet, sir?" he repeated in amazement. "Why, this is Mr. Laverick himself, is it not?" "Certainly," was the quiet reply. "I am Stephen Laverick." The clerk called the head cashier, who also stared at Laverick as though he were a ghost. They whispered together in the background for a moment, and their faces were a study in perplexity. Of Laverick's identity, however, there was no manner of doubt. Besides, the presence of what was obviously a very ample escort somewhat reassured them. The cashier himself came forward. "We shall be exceedingly glad, Mr. Laverick," he said dryly, "to get rid of your packet. Your instructions were that we should disregard all orders to hand it over to any person whatsoever, and I may say that they have been strictly adhered to. We have, however, had 2 applications in your name this morning." "They were both forgeries," Laverick declared. The cashier hesitated. Then he leaned across the broad mahogany counter towards Laverick. One of the men who appeared to form part of the escort detached himself from them and approached a few steps nearer. "This gentleman is your friend, sir?" the cashier asked, glancing towards him. "He is my solicitor," Laverick answered, "and is entirely in my confidence. If you have anything to tell me, I should like Mr. Bellamy also to hear." Bellamy, who was standing a little in the background, took his place by Laverick's side. The cashier, who knew him by sight, bowed. "Beside these 2 forged orders, sir," he said, turning again to Laverick, "we have had a man who took a room in the hotel leave a small black bag here, which he insisted upon having deposited in our document safe. My assistant had accepted it and was actually locking it up, when he noticed a faint sound inside which he could not understand. The bag was opened and found to contain an infernal machine which would have exploded in a quarter of an hour." Bellamy drew his breath sharply between his teeth. "We should have thought of that," he exclaimed softly. "That's Kahn's work." "I seem to have given you a great deal of trouble," Laverick remarked quietly. "I gather, however, from what you say, that my packet is still in your possession?" "It is, sir," the man assented. "We have two detectives from Scotland Yard here at the present moment, though, and we had almost decided to place it in their charge for greater security." "It will be well taken care of from now, I promise you," Laverick declared. The cashier and his clerk led the way into the inner office. At their invitation, Laverick and his solicitor followed, and a few yards behind came the two plain-clothes policemen, Bellamy and the superintendent. The safe was opened and the packet placed in Laverick's hands. He passed it on at once to Bellamy, and immediately afterwards the door behind was thronged with men, apparently ordinary loiterers around the hotel. They made a slow and exceedingly cautious exit. Once outside, Bellamy turned to Laverick with outstretched hands. "Au revoir and good luck, old chap," he said heartily. "I think you'll find things go your way all right tomorrow morning." He departed, forming one of a somewhat singular cavalcade, two of his friends on either side, two in front and two behind. It had almost the appearance of a procession. The whole party stepped into a closed motor car. 3 or 4 men were lounging on the pavement, and there was some excited whispering, but no one actually interfered. As soon as they had left the courtyard, Laverick and his solicitor, with his own guard, re-entered the motor car in which they had arrived, and drove back to Bow Street. Very few words were exchanged during the short journey. His solicitor, however, bade him good night cheerfully, and Laverick's bearing was by no means the bearing of a man in despair. In Downing Street, within the next half hour, a somewhat remarkable little gathering took place. The two men chiefly responsible for the destinies of the nation, the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, sat side by side before a small table. Facing them was Bellamy, and spread out in front were those few pages of foolscap released from their envelope a few minutes ago for the first time since the hand of the great Chancellor himself had pressed down the seal. The Foreign Minister had just finished a translation for the benefit of his colleague, and the two men were silent, as men are in the presence of big events. "Bellamy," the Prime Minister said slowly, "you are willing to stake, I presume, your reputation upon the authenticity of this document?" "My honor and my life, if you will," Bellamy answered earnestly. "That is no copy which you have there. On the contrary, the handwriting is the handwriting of the Chancellor himself." The Prime Minister turned silently towards his colleague. The latter, whose eyes still seemed glued to those fateful words, looked up. "All I can say is this," he remarked impressively, "that never in my time have I seen written words possessed of so much significance. One moment, if you please." He touched the bell, and his private secretary entered at once from an adjoining room. "Anthony," he said, "telephone to the Great Western Railway Company at Paddington. Ask for the station master in my name, and see that a special train is held ready to depart for Windsor in half an hour. Tell the station master that all ordinary traffic must be held up, but that the destination of the special is not to be divulged." The young man bowed and withdrew. "The more I consider this matter," the Foreign Minister went on, "the more miraculous does the appearance of this document seem. We now know why the Czar is struggling so frantically to curtail his visit, why he came as it were under protest and seeks everywhere for an opportunity to leave before the appointed time. His health is all right. He has had a hint from Vienna that there has been a leakage. His special mission only reached Paris this morning. The President is in the country and their audience is not fixed until tomorrow. Rawson will go over with a copy of these papers and a dispatch from His Majesty by the 9 o'clock train. It is not often that we have had the chance of such a coup as this." He drew his chief a few steps away. They whispered together for several moments. When they returned, the Foreign Minister rang the bell again for his secretary. "Anthony," he said, "Sir James and I will be leaving in a few minutes for Windsor. Go round yourself to General Hamilton, telephone to Aldershot for Lord Neville, and call round at the Admiralty Board for Sir John Harrison. Tell them all to be here at 10 o'clock tonight. If I am not back, they must wait. If either of them have royal commands, you need only repeat the word Finisterre. They will understand." The young man once more withdrew. The Prime Minister turned back to his papers. "It will be worth a great deal," he remarked with a grim smile, "to see His Majesty's face when he reads this." "It will be worth a great deal more," his fellow statesman answered dryly, "to be with his august cousin at the interview which will follow. A month ago the thought that war might come under our administration was a continual terror to me. Today things are entirely different. Today it really seems that if war does come, it may be the most glorious happening for England of this century. You saw the last report from Kiel?" Sir James nodded. "There isn't a battleship or a cruiser worth a snap of the fingers south of the German Ocean," his colleague continued earnestly. "They are cooped up, safe enough, they think, under the shelter of their fortifications. Hamilton has another idea. Between you and me, Sir James, so have I. I tell you," he went on in a deeper and more passionate tone, "it's like the passing of a terrible nightmare, this. We have had 10 years of panic, of nervous fears of a German invasion, and no one knows more than you and I, Sir James, how much cause we have had for those fears. It will seem strange if, after all, history has to write that chapter differently." The secretary re-entered and announced the result of his telephone interview with the superintendent at Paddington. The two great men rose. The Prime Minister held out his hand to Bellamy. "Bellamy," he declared, "you've done us one more important service. There may be work for you within the next few weeks, but you've earned a rest for a day or two at any rate. There is nothing more we can do?" "Nothing except a letter to the Home Secretary, Sir James," Bellamy answered. "Remember, sir, that although I have worked hard, the man to whom we really owe those papers is Stephen Laverick." The Prime Minister frowned thoughtfully. "It is a difficult situation, Bellamy," he said. "You are asking a great deal when you suggest that we should interfere in the slightest manner with the course of justice. You are absolutely convinced, I suppose, that this man Laverick had nothing to do with the murder?" "Absolutely and entirely, sir," Bellamy replied. "The murdered man has never been identified by the police," Sir James remarked. "Who was he?" "His name was Rudolph von Behrling," Bellamy announced, "and he was actually the Chancellor's nephew, also his private secretary. I have told you the history, sir, of those papers. It was von Behrling who, without a doubt, murdered the American journalist and secured them. It was he who insisted upon coming to London instead of returning with them to Vienna, which would have been the most obvious course for him to have adopted. He was a pauper and desperately in love with a certain lady who has helped me throughout this matter. He agreed to part with those papers for £20,000, and the lady, incidentally, promised to elope with him the same night. I met him by appointment at that little restaurant in the city, paid him the £20,000, and received the false packet which you remember I brought to you, sir. As a matter of fact, von Behrling, either by accident or design, and no man now will ever know which, left me with those papers which I was supposed to have bought in his possession, and also the money. Within 5 minutes he was murdered. Doubtless we shall know some time by whom, but it was not by Stephen Laverick. Laverick's share in the whole thing was nothing but this, that he found the pocketbook, and that he made use of the notes in his business for 24 hours to save himself from ruin. That was unjustifiable, of course. He has made atonement. The notes at this minute are in a safe deposit vault, and will be returned intact to the fund from which they came. I want also to impress upon you, Sir James, the fact that Baron de Streuss offered £100,000 for that letter." Sir James nodded thoughtfully. He stooped down and scrawled a few lines on half a sheet of notepaper. "You must take this to Lord Estcourt at once," he said, "and tell him the whole affair, omitting all specific information as to the nature of the papers. The thing must be arranged, of course." Half a dozen reporters who had somehow got hold of the fact that the Prime Minister and his colleague from the Foreign Office were going down to Windsor on a special mission followed them, but even they remained altogether in the dark as to the events which were really transpiring. They knew nothing of the interview between the Czar and his august host, an interview which in itself was a chapter in the history of these times. They knew nothing of the reason of their royal visitor's decision to prolong his visit instead of shortening it, or of his autographed letter to the President of the French Republic, which reached Paris even before the special mission from St. Petersburg had presented themselves. The one thing which they did know and that alone was significant, was that the Czar's foreign minister was cabled for that night to come to his master by special train from St. Petersburg. At the Austrian and German embassies, forewarned by a report from Baron de Streuss, something like consternation reigned. The Russian ambassador, heckled to death, took refuge at Windsor under pretense of a command from his royal master. The happiest man in London was Prince Rosmarin. End of chapter 35. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 36 of Havoc by E. Phillips OPPENHEIM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 36. Laverick Acquitted. At midday on the following morning, Laverick stepped down from the dock at Bow Street and, as the evening papers put it, in company with his friends, left the court. The proceedings altogether took scarcely more than half an hour. Laverick's solicitor first put Shepherd in the box, who gave his account of Morrison's visit to the restaurant, spoke of his hurried exit, and identified the knife which he had seen him snatch up. Cross-examined as to why he had kept silent, he explained that Mr. Morrison had been a good customer, and he saw no reason why he should give unsolicited evidence which would cost a man his life. Directly, however, another man had been accused, the matter appeared to him to be altogether different. He had come forward the moment he had heard of Laverick's arrest to offer his evidence. While the opinion of the court was still undecided, Laverick's solicitor called Miss Zoe Leneveu. A little murmur of interest ran through the court. Laverick himself started. Zoe stepped into the witness box, looking exceedingly pale and with a bandage over the upper part of her head. She admitted that she was the half-sister of Arthur Morrison, although there was no blood relationship. She described his sudden visit to her rooms on the night of the murder and his state of great alarm. She declared that he had confessed to her on the previous afternoon that he had been guilty of the murder in question. Her place in the witness box was taken by the Honorable David Bellamy. He declared that the prisoner was an old friend of his, and that the £20,000 of which he had been recently possessed had come from him for an investment in Laverick's business. The circumstances, he admitted, were somewhat peculiar, and until negotiations had been concluded, Mr. Laverick had doubtless felt uncertain how to make use of the money. But he assured the court that there was no person who had any claim to the sum of money in question save himself, and that he was perfectly aware of the use to which Laverick had put it. Laverick was discharged within a very few minutes, and a warrant was issued for the apprehension of Morrison. Laverick found Bellamy waiting for him, and was hurried into his motor. "Well, you see," the latter exclaimed, "we kept our word. That dear, plucky little friend of yours turned the scale. But in any case, I think that there would not have been much trouble about the matter. The magistrate had received a communication direct from the Home Secretary concerning your case." "I am very grateful indeed," Laverick declared. "I tell you, I think I am very lucky. I wish I knew what had become of Miss Leneveu. The usher told me she left the court before we came out." "I asked her to go straight back to her rooms," Bellamy said. "You must excuse me for interfering, Laverick, but I found her almost in a state of collapse last night in Jermyn Street. I was having Morrison watched, and my man reported to me that he had left his rooms in a state of great excitement, and that a young lady was there who appeared to be seriously injured." "Damned scamp," Laverick muttered. "I did everything I could," Bellamy continued. "I fetched her at once and sent her back to her house with a hospital nurse and some one to look after her. The wound wasn't serious, but the fellow must have been a brute indeed to have lifted his hand against such a child. I wonder whether he'll get away." "I should doubt it," Laverick remarked. "He hasn't the nerve. He'll probably get drunk and blow his brains out. He's a broken-spirited cur, after all." "You'll have some lunch?" Bellamy asked. Laverick shook his head. "If you don't mind, I'd like to go on and see Miss Leneveu." "Put me down at the club, then, and take my car on, if you will." Laverick walked up and down the pavement outside Zoe's little house for nearly half an hour. He had found the door closed and locked, and a neighbor had informed him that Miss Leneveu had gone out in a cab with a nurse some time ago, and had not returned. Laverick sent Bellamy's car back and waited. Presently a four-wheeled cab came round the corner and stopped in front of her house. Laverick opened the door and helped Zoe out. She was as white as death, and the nurse who was with her was looking anxious. "You are safe, then?" she murmured, holding out her hands. "Quite," he answered. "You dear little girl." Zoe had fainted, however, and Laverick hurried out for the doctor. Curiously enough, it was the same man who only a week or so ago had come to see Arthur Morrison. "She has had a bad scalp wound," he declared, "and her nervous system is very much run down. There is nothing serious. She seems to have just escaped concussion. The nurse had better stay with her for another day at any rate." "You are sure that it isn't serious?" Laverick asked eagerly. "Not in the least," the doctor answered dryly. "I see worse wounds every day of my life. I'll come again tomorrow if you like, but it really isn't necessary with the nurse on the spot." His natural pessimism was for a moment lightened by the fee which Laverick pressed upon him, and he departed with a few more encouraging words. Laverick stayed and talked for a short time with the nurse. "She has gone off to sleep now, sir," the latter announced. "There isn't anything to worry about. She seems as though she had been having a hard time, though. There was scarcely a thing in the house but half a packet of tea, and these." She held up a packet of pawn tickets. "I found these in a drawer when I came," she said. "I had to look round because there was no money and nothing whatever in the house." Laverick was suddenly conscious of an absurd mistiness before his eyes. "Poor little woman," he murmured. "I think she'd sooner have starved than asked for help." The nurse smiled. "I thought at first that she was rather a vain young lady," she remarked. "An empty larder and a pile of pawn tickets, and a new hat with a receipted bill for 30 shillings," she added, pointing to the sofa. Laverick placed some notes in her hands. "Please keep these," he begged, "and see that she has everything she wants. I shall be here again later in the day. There is not the slightest need for all this. She will be quite well off for the rest of her life. Will you try and engage someone for a day or two to come in until she is able to be moved?" "I'll look after her," the nurse promised. Laverick went reluctantly away. The events of the last few days were becoming more and more like a dream to him. He went to his club almost from habit. Presently the excitement which all London seemed to be sharing drove his own personal feelings a little into the background. The air was full of rumors. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary were spoken of as one speaks of heroes. Nothing was definitely known, but there was a splendid feeling of confidence that for once in her history England was preparing to justify her existence as a great power. End of chapter 36. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 37 of Havoc by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 37. The Plot That Failed. The progress of the Czar from Buckingham Palace to the Mansion House, where he had, after all, consented to lunch with the Lord Mayor, witnessed a popular outburst of enthusiasm absolutely inexplicable to the general public. It was known that affairs in Central Europe were in a dangerously precarious state, and it was felt that the Czar's visit here and the urgent summons which had brought from St. Petersburg his foreign minister were indications that the long-wished-for entente between Russia and this country was now actually at hand. There was in the press a curious reticence with regard to the development of the political situation. One felt everywhere that it was the calm before the storm, that at any moment the great black headlines might tell of some startling stroke of diplomacy, some dangerous peril averted or defied. The circumstances themselves of the Czar's visit had been a little peculiar. On his arrival it was announced that, for reasons of health, the original period of his stay, namely a week, was to be cut down to 2 days. No sooner had he arrived at Windsor, however, than a change was announced. The Czar had so far recovered as to be able even to extend the period at first fixed for his visit. Simultaneously with this, the German and Austrian press were full of bitter and barely veiled articles whose meaning was unmistakable. The Czar had thrown in his lot at first with Austria and Germany. That he was going deliberately to break away from that arrangement there seemed now scarcely any matter of doubt. Bellamy and Louise, from a window in Fleet Street, watched him go by. Prince Rosmaran had been specially bidden to the luncheon, but he too had been with them earlier in the morning. Afterwards they turned their backs upon the city, and as soon as the crowd had thinned, made their way to one of the West End restaurants. "It seems too good to be true," declared Louise. Bellamy nodded. "Nevertheless, I am convinced that it is true. The humor of the whole thing is that it was our friends in Germany themselves who pressed the Czar not to altogether cancel his visit for fear of exciting suspicion. That, of course, was when there seemed to be no question of the news of the Vienna compact leaking out. They would never have dared to expose a man to such a trial as the Czar must have faced when the résumé of the Vienna proceedings in the Chancellor's own handwriting was read to him at Windsor." "You saw the telegram from Paris?" Louise interposed. "The special mission from St. Petersburg has been recalled." Bellamy smiled. "It all goes to prove what I say," he went on. "Any morning you may expect to hear that Austria and Germany have received an ultimatum." "I wonder," she remarked, "what became of Streuss?" "He is hiding somewhere in London, without a doubt," Bellamy answered. "There's always plenty of work for spies." "Don't use that word," she begged. He made a little grimace. "You are thinking of my own connection with the profession, are you not?" he asked. "Well, that counts for nothing now. I hope I may still serve my country for many years, but it must be in a different way." "What do you mean?" she demanded. "I heard from my uncle's solicitors this morning," Bellamy continued, "that he is very feeble and cannot live more than a few months. When he dies, of course, I must take my place in the House of Lords. It is his wish that I should not leave England again now, so I suppose there is nothing left for me but to give it up. I have done my share of traveling and work, after all," he concluded thoughtfully. "Your share indeed," she murmured. "Remember, but for that document which was read to the Czar at Windsor, Servia must have gone down, and England would have had to take a place among the second-class powers. There may be war now, it is true, but it will be a glorious war." "Louise, very soon we shall know. Until then, I will say nothing. But I do not want you altogether to forget that there has been something in my life dearer to me even than my career for these last few years." Her blue eyes were suddenly soft. She looked across towards him wistfully. "Dear," she whispered, "things will be altered with you now. I am not fit to be the wife of an English peer. I am not noble." He laughed. "I am afraid," he assured her, "that I am democrat enough to think you one of the noblest women on earth. Why should I not? Your life itself has been a study in devotion. The modern virtues seem almost to ignore patriotism, yet the love of one's country is a splendid thing. But don't you think, Louise, that we have done our work, that it is time to think of ourselves?" She gave him her hand. "Let us see," she said. "Let us wait for a little time and see what comes." That night another proof of the popular feeling, absolutely spontaneous, broke out in one of the least expected places. Louise was encored for her wonderful solo in a modern opera of bellicose trend, and instead of repeating it, she came alone on the stage after a few minutes' absence, dressed in Servian national dress. For a short time the costume was not recognized. Then the music, the national hymn of Servia, and the recollection of her parentage brought the thing home to the audience. They did not even wait for her to finish. In the middle of her song the applause broke like a crash of thunder. From the packed gallery to the stalls they cheered wildly, madly. A dozen times she came before the curtain. It seemed impossible that they would ever let her go. Directly she turned to leave the stage, the uproar broke out again. The manager at last insisted upon it that she should speak a few words. She stood in the center of the stage amid a silence as complete as the previous applause had been unanimous. Her voice reached easily to every place in the house. "I thank you all very much," she said. "I am very happy indeed to be in London, because it is the capital city of the most generous country in the world, the country that is always ready to protect and help her weaker neighbors. I am a Servian, and I love my country, And therefore," she added, with a little break in her voice, "therefore, I love you all." It was nearly midnight before the audience was got rid of, and the streets of London had not been so impassable for years. Crowds made their way to the front of Buckingham Palace and on to the War Office, where men were working late. Everything seemed to denote that the spirit of the country was roused. The papers next morning made immense capital of the incident, and for the following 24 hours suspense throughout the country was almost at fever height. It was known that the Cabinet Council had been sitting for 6 hours. It was known, too, that without the least commotion, without scarcely any movements of ships that could be called directly threatening, the greatest naval force which the world had ever known was assembling off Dover. The stock markets were wildly excited. Laverick, back again in his office, found that his return to his accustomed haunts occasioned scarcely any comment. More startling events were shaping themselves. His own remarkable adventure remained, curiously enough, almost undiscussed. He left the office shortly before his usual time, notwithstanding the rush of business, and drove at once to the little house in Theobald Square. Zoe was lying on the sofa, still white, but eager to declare that the pain had gone and that she was no longer suffering. "It is too absurd," she declared, smiling, "my having this nurse here. Really, there is nothing whatever the matter with me. I should have gone to the theatre, but you see it is no use." She passed him the letter which she had been reading, and which contained her somewhat curt dismissal. He laughed as he tore it into pieces. "Are you so sorry, Zoe? Is the stage so wonderful a place that you could not bear to think of leaving it?" She shook her head. "It is not that," she whispered. "You know that it is not that." He smiled as he took her confidently into his arms. "There is a much more arduous life in front of you, dear," he said. "You have to come and look after me for the rest of your days. A bachelor who marries as late in life as I do, you know, is a trying sort of person." She shrank away a little. "You don't mean it," she murmured. "You know very well that I mean it," he answered, kissing her. "I think you knew it from the very first that sooner or later you were doomed to become my wife." She sighed faintly and half closed her eyes. For the moment she had forgotten everything. She was absolutely and completely happy. Later on he made her dress and come out to dinner, and afterwards, as they sat talking, he laid an evening paper before her. "Zoe," he declared, "the best thing that could has happened. You will not be foolish, dear, about it, I know. Remember the alternative, and read that." She glanced at the few lines which announced the finding of Arthur Morrison in a house in Bloomsbury Square. The police had apparently tracked him down, and he had shot himself at the final moment. The details of his last few hours were indescribable. Zoe shuddered, and her eyes filled with tears. She smiled bravely in his face, however. "It is terrible," she whispered simply. "But after all, he was no relation of mine, and he tried to do you a frightful injury. When I think of that, I find it hard even to be sorry." There was indeed almost a pitiless look in her face as she folded up the paper, as though she felt something of that common instinct of her sex, which transforms a gentle woman so quickly into a hard, merciless creature when the being whom she loves is threatened. Laverick smiled. "Let us go out into the streets," he said, "and hear what all this excitement is about." They bought a late edition, and there it was at last, in black and white. An ultimatum had been presented at Berlin and Vienna. Certain treaty rights which had been broken with regard to Austria's action in the East were insisted upon by Great Britain. It was demanded that Austria should cease the mobilization of her troops upon the Servian border, and renounce all rights to a protectorate over that country whose independence Great Britain felt called upon from that time forward to guarantee. It was further announced that England, France, and Russia were acting in this manner in complete concert, and that the neutrality of Italy was assured. Further, it was known that the great English fleet had left for the North Sea with sealed orders. Laverick took Zoe home early and called later at Bellamy's rooms. Bellamy greeted him heartily. He was on the point of going out, and the two men drove off together in the latter's car. "See, my friend," Bellamy exclaimed, "what great things come from small means! The document which you preserved for us, and for which we had to fight so hard, has done all this." "It is marvelous," Laverick murmured. "It is very simple," Bellamy declared. "That meeting in Vienna was meant to force our hands. It is all a question of the balance of strength. Germany and Austria together, with Russia friendly, even with Russia neutral, could have defied Europe. Germany could have spread out her army westwards while Austria seized upon her prey. It was a splendid plot, and it was going very well until the Czar himself was suddenly confronted by our King and his ministers with a revelation of the whole affair. At Windsor, the thing seemed different to him. The French government behaved splendidly, and the Czar behaved like a man. Germany and Austria are left plantés là. If they fight, well, it will be no one-sided affair. They have no fleet, or rather, they will have none in a fortnight's time. They have no means of landing an army here. Austria perhaps could hold Russia, but with a French army in better shape than it has been for years, and the English landing as many men as they care to do with ease anywhere on the north coast of Germany, the entire scheme proved abortive. Come into the club and have a drink, Laverick. Today great things have happened to me." "And to me," Laverick interposed. "You can guess my news, perhaps," Bellamy said, as they seated themselves in easy chairs. "Mademoiselle Idiale has promised to be my wife." Laverick held out his hand. "I congratulate you heartily," he exclaimed. "I have been an engaged man myself for something like half an hour." Chapter 37. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 38 of Havoc by E. Phillips OPPENHEIM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 38. A Farewell Appearance. "One thing at least these recent adventures should teach whoever may be responsible for the government of this country," Bellamy remarked to his wife as he laid down the morning paper. "For the first time in many years we have taken the aggressive against powers of equal standing. We were always rather good at bullying smaller countries, but the bare idea of an ultimatum to Germany would have made our late Premier go light-headed." "And yet it succeeded," Louise reminded him. "Absolutely," he affirmed. "Today's news makes peace a certainty. If your country knew everything, Louise, they'd give us a royal welcome next month." "You really mean that we are going to go there, then?" she asked. "It isn't exactly one of my privileges," he declared, "to fix upon the spot where we shall take our belated honeymoon, but I haven't been in Belgrade for years, and I know you'd like to see your people." "It will be more happiness than I ever dreamed of," she murmured. "Do you think we shall be safe in passing through Vienna?" Bellamy laughed. "Remember," he said, "that I am no longer David Bellamy, with a silver greyhound attached to my watch chain and an obnoxious reputation in foreign countries. I am Lord Denchester of Denchester, a harmless English peer traveling on his honeymoon. By the way, I hope you like the title." "I shall love it when I get used to it," she declared. "To be an English Countess is dazzling, but I do think that I ought not to go on singing at Covent Garden." "Tomorrow will be your last night," he reminded her. "I have asked Laverick and the dear little girl he is going to marry to come with me. Afterwards we must all have supper together." "How nice of you!" she exclaimed. "I don't know about that," Bellamy said, smiling. "I really like Laverick. He is a decent fellow and a good sort. Incidentally, he was thundering useful to us, and pretty plucky about it. He interests me, too, in another way. He is a man who, face to face with a moral problem, acted exactly as I should have done myself." "You mean about the £20,000?" she asked. Bellamy assented. "He was practically dishonest," he pointed out. "He had no right to use that money, and he ought to have taken the pocketbook to the police station. If he had done so, that is to say, if he had waited there for the police, if he had been seen to hold out that pocketbook, to have discussed it with any one, it is 10 to 1 that there would have been another tragedy that night. At any rate, the document would never have come to us." She smiled. "My moral judgment is warped," she asserted, "from the fact that Laverick's decision brought us the document." He nodded. Perhaps so, he agreed. And yet there was the man face to face with ruin. The face of that money for a few hours did no one any harm and saved him. I say that such a deed is always a matter of calculation, and in this case that he was justified. "I wonder what he really thinks about it himself," she remarked. "Perhaps I'll ask him." But when the time came, and he sat in the box with Laverick and Zoe, he forgot everything else in the joy of watching the woman whom he had loved so long. She moved about the stage that night as though her feet indeed fell upon the air. She appeared to be singing always with restraint, yet with some new power in her voice, a quality which even in her simpler notes left the great audience thrilled. Already there was a rumor that it was her last appearance. Her marriage to Bellamy had been that day announced in the Morning Post. When, in the last act, she sang alone on the stage the famous love song, it seemed to them that although her voice trembled more than once, it was a new thing to which they listened. Zoe found herself clasping Laverick's hand in tremulous excitement. Bellamy sat like a statue, a little back in the box, his clean-cut face thrown into powerful relief by the shadows beyond. Yet, as he listened, his eyes, too, were marvelously soft. The song grew and grew till, with the last notes, the whole story of an exquisite and expectant passion seemed trembling in her voice. The last note came from her lips almost as though unwillingly, and was prolonged for an extraordinary period. When it died away, its passing seemed something almost unrealizable. It quivered away into a silence which lasted for many seconds before the gathering roar of applause swept the house. And in those last few seconds she had turned and faced Bellamy. Their eyes met, and the light which flashed from his seemed answered by the quivering of her throat. It was her good-bye. She was singing a new love song, singing her way into the life of the man whom she loved, singing her way into love itself. Once more the great house, packed to the ceiling, was worked up to a state of frenzied excitement. Bellamy was recognized, and the significance of her song sent a wave of sentiment through the house whose only possible form of expression took to itself shape in the frantic greetings which called her to the front again and again. But the three in the box were silent. Bellamy stood back in the shadows. Laverick and Zoe seemed suddenly to become immersed in themselves. Bellamy threw open the door of the box and pointed outside. "At Luigi's in half an hour," he said softly. "You will excuse me for a few minutes? I am going to Louise." This is the end of Havoc by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.